So good afternoon. Thank you for holding this hearing today on urgent issues in freight rail service and for the opportunity to provide these comments today that are in addition to our more comprehensive written testimony that was already provided. My name is Matt Hollis, and I'm a second generation 18-year railroader currently serving as National Vice President and Special Assistant to the President of the Transportation Communications Union, TCU. In my assignment, I'm responsible for the overall representation of our members on each of the major freight carriers. For reference, TCU represents many different employees across the rail industry, including the clerical, which itself is somewhat of an umbrella term for many different job classifications, including the intermodal equipment operators and intermodal service workers that we will talk about today. The Brotherhood of Railroad Carmen, the employees that inspect and maintain the rail cars, as well as many others. I'm also testifying today on behalf of our machinist brothers and sisters, represented by the International Association of Machinists, the IAM's District Lodge 19. Together, TCU and IAM District Lodge 19 make up the IAM Railroad Division. I'd like to preface my testimony today by saying up front that some of my remarks will be related to traditional labor matters like wages and working conditions, including safety. And while I understand that the STB is the economic regulator, there is a fact that service provided by the railroads is inextricably linked to the conditions of the railroads. And that includes the conditions of their rolling stock, infrastructure, and more important, the condition of their workforce. From my position at TCU, I've had a front row seat to the complete and utter degradation of the nation's Class I railroads over the past few years. I've watched as private equity firms have acquired controlling stakes in railroads only to use their power to deploy business models that extract as much wealth as possible, as evidenced by the Norfolk Southern's $10 billion stock buyback that we heard about yesterday. And all of this to the detriment of the railroad workers, their customers, and ultimately the public's interest. The Class I railroads have each deployed their own variations of their precision scheduled railroading or PSR business model, which, as we've heard, is a misnomer, as anyone can tell you that PSR is neither precise, well-scheduled, and it hardly resembles real railroading. A more accurate description would be doing less with less or moving fewer carloads with drastically fewer employees. And of particular importance to this board, they've made a career on the railroad that was once a pathway to the middle class and the upper middle class into a career that is hostile, unappealing, and taking what was once considered highly desired and competitive positions to what you're seeing today, a labor shortage where people refuse recall or outright resign their positions mid-career. And all of this is due to the railroad's persistent pursuit of the almighty operating ratio, or as I call it, their false profit. Their singular goal has been to reduce costs to the railroads in salaries for workers, headcounts, and service for customers to reduce the operating ratio and massively boost their profits. And for our testimony today, we want to highlight three specific crafts that we believe should best demonstrate the current issues with the workforce and the freight rail service. I'll start with the intermodal equipment operators or the intermodal service employees. TCU's intermodal workers have been at the forefront of our nation's supply chain crisis during the past few years. As background, these employees load and unload intermodal shipping containers using cranes, side-loading vehicles, and drayage equipment. They rely on their equipment to be in top working order. Unfortunately, that is often not the case in today's intermodal environment. Our members often report their equipment is broken or in sad states of disrepair, and that was before the COVID-related equipment shortages. And all that does is further compound the work onto the fewer pieces of equipment that are actually working. To make matters worse, our intermodal facilities have become dangerously understaffed. And considering the minimum time to be trained to operate this equipment is at least 6 months, even if the railroads were successful to bring in new hires, which they have not demonstrated an ability to do, they would not be fully qualified for months. At CSX, their intermodal headcounts have been reduced from 623 employees in 2018 to 437 today. That's a 30% decrease. Even in the past 2 years, during the height of the intermodal boom, CSX intermodal employee headcount dropped by 50. And many of these losses are a direct result of resignations as intermodal equipment operators have been exhausted by the increasing workloads and the rigorous demands of management. CSX intermodal employees have the lowest rate of pay among their peers, new hires starting and capping out at $20.06 an hour, as has been the case since 2019. with no new efforts from management to incentivize new hires have been made, despite the pleas from the local managers, supervisors, and union officials like myself. CSX has experienced record profits and record workloads on a per capita basis, and requests to increase pay or provide incentive bonuses or payouts are being refused and blamed on the stalled round of current bargaining. I would ask the board to consider to put yourself in our members' shoes, being asked to work throughout COVID and performing forced overtime, mandated 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, while your company reaps record gains. Is it too much to ask for or expect a raise, perhaps a bonus? You know, there's a lot of rhetoric that goes around in the COVID era thanking frontline workers for their efforts, including during this hearing, but never is that gratitude backed up in any material way, at least not in the railroad industry. CSX has done very little to address the intermodal manpower shortages. In fact, just last week, CSX CEO Jim Foote said in their quarterly earnings call that other than conductors and engineers, they don't need any more workers, intermodal workers included, or any other of the crafts that we represent, only operating crews. And this is simply not true. In fact, I would challenge Mr. Foote to go to any of our intermodal yards or any of our mechanical shops and try to sell that message to our members. While CSX leads in this race to the bottom, they're certainly not alone in neglecting the intermodal workforce. It's the same sad story at practically every carrier. Nobody wants to work the job the way it's being offered. Mandatory 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, on your feet all day, hustling as fast as possible, or perhaps just as Mr. Foote described it yesterday, being expected to work like a dog. There's no question the low wages and the unreasonable workload demands that are brought on by PSR have resulted in a workforce that is simply incapable of keeping up with the volumes at the nation's intermodal facilities. I heard Commissioner Bensel yesterday morning describe the numbers in detail. A 21% growth in intermodal traffic in the last year, but somehow the railroad's intermodal volumes dropped 16.8%. If that is not a telling statistic of intentionally limiting your own service, I don't know what is. Even so, in many locations, due in part to the shuttering of the yards and destaffing over the years, the traffic is now so congested that our intermodal employees have been forced to stack containers anywhere and everywhere there is a vacant piece of real estate. This often results in the containers being stacked in congested rows of multiple levels, creating multiple movements to retrieve every container for shipment. And when the real estate at the terminal simply runs out, which does happen in a lot of areas, the carriers are then forced to rent or to develop parking areas nearby that act as holding lots for shipping containers, none of which are well operated, regulated through the traditional in and out gate processes. With the reduction of crew availability and the multi-mile link train lengths, the promises that were made as PSR was rolled out simply aren't coming true. Trains often arrive at a terminal already filled to capacity and incapable of picking up the scheduled shipments. Moreover, most of the carriers' intermodal facilities simply aren't designed to support the multi-mile train lengths. This provides an even greater complexity. Suffice it to say this, intermodal traffic is hitting snags at every corner of the PSR model, and every one of those snags results in more loads, unloading, grounding, drayage, parking, inspecting, etc. by our members on the ground. And yet, despite the growing volumes, as Commissioner Bensel mentioned, the workforce is still shrinking at an alarming rate. This causes a vicious cycle of pushing the remaining workload onto fewer and fewer, making the job harder and harder and making it more difficult to retain or to hire. It's simply not a sustainable model. I'll turn to the Brotherhood of Railway Carmen now. And the Carmen craft includes the employees that, as I mentioned, they inspect, repair, and maintain the freight rail cars. They assemble trains in yards and perform air brake tests prior to departure. And more specifically, they inspect practically every safety-related point on a rail car. In total, there are approximately 90 inspection points per car per side, or 180 per car, depending on the type of car. Our Carmen also perform repairs, both on the repair in place track or the RIP track, as well as the more comprehensive repairs in the shops. Their skill set is an apprentice track position, meaning that you're hired into the Carmen craft as an apprentice, and you spend 732 working days to become a journeyman. Unfortunately, the Carmen career, like other crafts, has undergone a transformation in the PSR era. What was once a tough but good living has been transformed into a hostile environment where our members are constantly harassed and pressured by local management to work faster, to skip inspections, and to allow bad order cars to leave the yard. Outgoing trains are supposed to undergo a pre-departure inspection, where, as I mentioned, the carman would inspect up to 90 individual points per side. The carman used to be provided up to 3 minutes per car. Now they're expected to perform these same inspections in less than 1 minute. And it's absolutely impossible without cutting corners. Carman used to be able to get underneath cars to physically inspect various components. Now they're simply offered or allowed a brief visual inspection. As some of our carmen say, quote, "This is the only job where they train you to do a job and then they fire you for actually doing it." During the onset of PSR, carmen were repeatedly threatened by local management that if they didn't improve their speeds, that management would close their yard. Well, because of the manpower shortages, which were caused by the railroads themselves, the remaining carmen are forced to work massive amounts of overtime, many times 16-hour shifts, several days in a row. Some report of sleeping in their cars rather than wasting the time commuting home, just so that they can get an extra hour or two of rest. Our members often reference the joke pirate flag that, quote, "the beatings will continue until morale improves." Well, nothing, unfortunately, more accurately describes the current state of a carman career. As a result of the worsening environment and constant forced overtime, the carman craft is experiencing record resignations. And we've provided several examples in our written comments, and we hope that you will give your attention to them. Since January 1st, 2019, we've seen 157 resignations from carmen at CSX and 271 from Union Pacific. More recently, since January 1st of 2021, there have been 144 resignations from Norfolk Southern and 143 from Burlington Northern. That's 715 resignations in total. Roughly 15% of the carman craft have walked out the door. That's not furloughs, that's resignations. And as the son of a railroad shopcraft employee, I can't stress this enough. This is not normal in this industry. As I've mentioned, these jobs were once prized positions. You had to know someone to get a job on the railroad. Today, the railroad cannot hire, but as evidenced, the railroads are struggling to retain their current workforce. Switching now to the machinist, the IAM District Lodge 19 represents the machinist craft on the railroads, and a machinist is a shopcraft employee whose primary function is to repair, overhaul, and maintain and inspect the locomotives and the track maintenance equipment. These are highly skilled craft employees trained by the railroad and often learning skills that are very unique to the railroad. These skills include working with complex pneumatic systems, machining parts with extremely small tolerances, rebuilding air brakes and truck assemblies, among many others. And as you can guess, my testimony will be that the machinist craft has been hit hard by PSR cuts as well. In 2015, Norfolk Southern employed approximately 1,100 machinists. In 2021, they had 476. At one shop, 8 machinists resigned in 1 month alone due to the forced overtime every shift, every day. At Norfolk Southern in Chattanooga, they recently attempted to recall 28 furloughed machinists, a majority of which did not return, eliminating over 100 years of combined experience. At Union Pacific, 78 machinists are currently furloughed across the system. And at Union Pacific's large North Platte shop, where there used to be 351 machinists, including 21 apprentices, today there are approximately 100 less machinists and no apprentices. 17 machinists recently resigned to seek out better employment opportunities, citing UP's toxic work environment, dehumanizing treatment of management, or their unrealistic expectations as a result of operational changes brought on by PSR. At BNSF and at CSX, the trends are unfortunately the same. And just like in the carman and the other shop crafts, the remaining machinists have faced the same pressures not to inspect or repair locomotives, limited time frames, reduced manpower, forcing the remaining work onto the hands of too few. And as one NS machinist wrote in his resignation letter, and I quote, "The culture changed from caring about safety to just getting engines out the door, whether they were fixed or not," end quote. The quality of a machinist career has deteriorated as well. Due to PSR job cuts, employees are forced to transfer all over the country to keep their jobs. At At CSX, a machinist with over 10 years of service was forced to transfer from Atlanta, Georgia to Nashville, Tennessee, then to Evansville, Indiana, bringing his family in tow each time before he finally resigned once he had found more secure employment and in the face of another furlough. I wish these were rare occurrences, but unfortunately, they have become commonplace. This forced job hopping happens constantly all across the Class 1 railroads among all the crafts, and it didn't used to be this way. And as you've already heard from others, the sad results of this new business model has been fairly obvious: a lack of serviceable locomotives and a lack of employees to service them. Today, while Union Pacific complains about lack of locomotive power that's available, they currently have over 2,000 locomotives sitting in storage. Unfortunately, nobody knows what kind of state those locomotives are in because, as Rich testified, all the railroads have made a habit of cannibalizing stored locomotives for parts. Today, many railroads are scrambling to put locomotives on the tracks. The only problem is they don't have machinists to prepare them or service them. They don't have crews to run them. They cut them. So in closing, I would just say I've heard the line of questions from the board to different witnesses that talk about suggestions for what can be done in the next 30, 60, or 90 days. And then the answer inevitably turns to the need to hire new employees and to ramp up training as people come into the workforce. But that's for new hires. And that does absolutely nothing to stem the tide of the mass exodus of experienced railroaders leaving their careers. But I can tell you something that the railroads can do today. They can get off their high horse, give our members a contract that they deserve, and they can treat their employees with the dignity that these people deserve doing their jobs every single day. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions.